You know how for years the Proxmox docs have basically said, if you want to run Docker, put it in a VM, don't install it on the host. With Proxmox version 9.1, that story just changed in a pretty big way. So Proxmox can now pull OCI container images, the same format Docker and friends use, and turn them directly into LXC containers. No Docker daemon, no Docker in a VM, just run a couple of containers, but there are caveats, and this is still marked as a tech preview, so let's walk through what this actually is, why it matters, and when you probably should and shouldn't use it. Also, really quick, about 90% of the people watching this aren't subscribed, so if you like deep dives into Proxmox, ZFS, different tools that make your life easier, do me a favor, hit subscribe and hit the like button. Also, thank you very much. We finally hit 4,000 subscribers right before the end of 2025. Howdy folks, I'm Zach Perry, back here with 45 Home Lab, and today we're talking about one of the most interesting changes in Proxmox 9.1, native support for OCI images inside LXC containers. Let's go into how Proxmox used to handle containerized workloads, what's new in Proxmox 9.1 with that OCI support, why this matters for home labbers and small labs, and where I'd stick with a Docker VM or Kubernetes instead. Think of this as your kind of like a mental model reset for how containers on Proxmox 2025 are run. So in the first part, we're going to go over a quick refresher, LXC versus Docker, and the Proxmox way. So before we talk about OCI images, we need to kind of set the stage. And Proxmox has always had two big building blocks, KVM VMs, full virtual machines, and LXC containers, so OS level containers that share the host kernel. Traditionally, if you wanted to run apps in containers on Proxmox, you'd have three main patterns. Classic LXC templates, where you'd pull a template from Proxmox's template library like Debian, Ubuntu, turnkey appliances, all that good stuff. And that gives you a system container, full distro, userland, systemd, SSH, all of that. And you then install your app inside of that container with app, DNF, whatever that OS has. And then you have Docker Podman inside the VM, so that's the official recommendation. And you create a Debian or Ubuntu VM, install Docker Podman, run your containers with Docker Run, Docker Compose, Podman, Cube, anything you like. Proxmox just sees one VM. It doesn't care what you've got, 10 containers running inside of it. And Docker in LXC, the please don't, but people still kind of do it option. Still works for some people, but that's where you install Docker inside of a privileged LXC. Hope the kernel and the C group setup doesn't break on the next Proxmox update. And this has always been a bit fragile, and Proxmox has historically discouraged it. And none of these approaches could just say, here's a Docker Hub URL, please pull that image, run directly on the Proxmox node. And that's exactly the gap Proxmox 9.1 is starting to close. Now in our next section, what are OCI images? So let's demystify the OCI thing quickly. And OCI stands for Open Container Initiative. It's a standard that defines things like how container images are structured, the layers, the manifest, the configs, how runtime should execute those images. Docker, container, Podman, modern container tooling all build, pull OCI compatible images from registries like Docker Hub, GitHub Container, or GHCR, Quay.io, or private registries. So when you say something like Proxmox supports OCI images now, they're not saying Proxmox suddenly ships the Docker daemon. They're saying more that Proxmox can pull an OCI image from a registry. It can unpack it and use it as the root file system for an LXC container. So instead of starting from a Debian 12 LXC template, installing the app, you can start from a ready-made OCI image that already contains your app, the dependencies. And the Proxmox helper scripts have actually been great for this, but this is just another tool in your toolkit, as I always like to say. So what's new in Proxmox 9.1? So with this latest release, there's now native support for building LXC containers from OCI images. High level, here's what's kind of changed in this newest release. So pulling OCI images from the GUI on a storage that holds, container templates like ZFS, LVM storage that has container templates. You're going to pull from an OCI registry. You'll have that option. From there, you can specify the registry plus the image like docker.io /nginx, let's say. And then, or you can authenticate to a private registry. Proxmox downloads the OCI image, stores it as a template in that storage. That template then shows up like any other kind of container, and you just go to create CT and you're off to the races. Next, system containers versus application containers. So when you can create a container from an OCI template, Proxmox can treat it as a system container, full environment with multiple services, similar to your usual LXC template, and it's useful if the image ships with a complete system. An application container, so minimal environment optimized to run a single app or microservice, closer in spirit to a Docker container. The official docs and release notes call out that Proxmox VE can now handle both system and application containers from OCI images, and explicitly pitch the application container approach to get leaner containers with better resource utilization. Now, under the hood, still LXC, still Proxmox. The important bit, Proxmox is not running Docker or containered. Everything is still managed as an LXC container. You still get Proxmox style backup, snapshots, resource limits, ZFS Ceph storage integration, all that good stuff that you're used to. And you can still use all the Proxmox tooling for CPU, memory limits, network configs, etc., etc. And you just swap the root file system for something else. So before, you'd have your Debian template, and now you have an OCI image from Docker Hub. Now, little warning, already mentioned, it is in a tech preview, so right now it's explicitly marked as such. OCI import for LXC is brand new in 9.1, has 2 weeks from filming, so proceed with some caution when you do download it. I wouldn't use it in a production environment yet. Using your home lab, test it out. I have, it's great, I like it, but for anything that's super important, maybe not. So why is everybody excited about this? Is it just hype? But one of the things is that there are less VMs, so up to now, if you wanted to have a containerized app the right way, on Proxmox, you'd usually stand up a Docker VM or small Kubernetes cluster, and it kind of eat that overhead of a full guest OS, dedicated RAM, vCPUs, separate monitoring and backup stories, so there's a bunch of different parts to it. But with OCI to LXC, you can run a Docker-style image directly under Proxmox, no separate VM, no extra OS overhead, just an LXC that happens to be built from an OCI image instead of a Debian template, let's say. For home lab, where you just want a handful of stateless services, say a small API, Nginx or traffic, reverse proxy, metrics exporter, Redis for any sort of testing. This can cut down on VM clutter. And you can finally reuse upstream images, and a ton of projects now only ship with a container image and maybe a Helm chart. Very few bother with deb packages, LXC templates, or Proxmox specific scripts. Now, with OCI support, if an upstream gives you GHCR.io, some app tag, you can plug that into Proxmox, pull it, and then run it as an LXC without using any custom image build or manual rootfs imports. And that's kind of a big quality of life improvement, so if you live in the container ecosystem already. And now, how does it differ from the usual way Docker VMs? Now, let's stack these options side by side, because this is where a lot of people kind of get confused. So one of the ways, Docker VM, the pattern would be you have your Proxmox VM using Debian, then you'd put Docker in that, use Compose, and run your containers inside of that. Now, the pros of that, it exactly matches how a lot of guides are written. It's how I currently have things set up. Works with everything, Compose files, Helms, charts, Swarm, etc. Very well understood isolation and security. But there are some cons to it. So you have extra resource overhead for the VM OS. Proxmox can't see individual containers, just the VM itself. Then you have Kubernetes, so you'd have your Proxmox, one or more VM, using K3s, Talos, etc. And the pros of this, if you're going all in on microservices, CI/CD pipelines, ingress controllers, all that good stuff that I don't really know much about, but it's probably overkill for just having a couple of containers. And then you have the newest one, which is the OCI to LXC. So Proxmox is going to pull those OCI images, convert to a CT template, and then it runs as an LXC. Now, pros, it has that lower overhead of a full VM, doesn't need Docker required, has snapshots, you can upstream OCI images without doing that LXC custom building. And there are some cons and gotchas. As I mentioned ad nauseum, still tech preview, not a full Docker experience, so you're not doing, your Docker Compose up on the host or anything like that. The Docker networking, like a lot of things that you are familiar with when it comes to Docker aren't going to be there. So some images assume that a Docker-like runtime environment for a specific entry point might not behave exactly as intended when used as a rootfs for an LXC. And now one thing to keep in mind as well for these sort of minimal containers like the Pertainer one that we use to access, you'll need to get the IP and the port, in this case 9443. Otherwise, you'll kind of be sitting at a blank screen like I did for a few minutes. So this isn't Proxmox just became a Docker host. It's more Proxmox learned how to kind of speak the same image format that Docker uses. So when should you use this? Here's how I kind of position the whole OCI on Proxmox in HomeLab right now. Great use case today is test labs and experiments. Again, it is a tech preview. Can I run my apps, Docker image, kind of an LXC and management through Proxmox tooling? It has lightweight single service containers if you're going to use it for that. If you're going to be running simple services that don't rely on complex compose stacks, it's kind of, if you're bridging worlds, so if you're mostly Proxmox plus LXC based, but a vendor only uses an OCI image, you can use that to integrate into your existing infrastructure. And there are good things for, it's like, can I run my apps on a Docker image in LXC using Proxmox tooling? It is good for lightweight, single containers, simple services that don't rely on complex compose stack. It's kind of bridging worlds. So if you're mostly Proxmox LXC based, but a vendor only ships that OCI image, you can now integrate that into your Proxmox infrastructure. Now, if you have a K8s cluster, Kubernetes, if it's heavily orchestrated, if your deployment story is, I have this giant compose file, you'll probably still be happier with Docker or Kubernetes VM right now, because it still is pretty bare bones. Proxmox labels this whole area kind of as a tech preview, so I'd wait for a couple of point releases before you kind of put it into a real world production sort of scenario. Remember, this is in LXC, sharing the Proxmox host kernel. That's not new, but it's easy to get excited and start pulling random images from Docker Hub. Treat them like you would treat packages, only pull from sources you trust. So there is a little bit of a security implication there. Now, with the classic way to deploy containers, LXC, OCI images, mix of them, all you'll need is hardware, like our HL15 Beast here with an ASRock motherboard, enough space for an ETX motherboard, full GPU, and over a terabyte of RAM. So that is the new OCI image support from Proxmox VE 9.1, kind of in a nutshell. You get those Docker-style images with Proxmox-style management. It's a huge quality of life upgrade for home labbers, as long as remember, it's a tech preview, like, say that a million times fast. But in a future video, I'd love to actually pull a few popular images from Docker Hub, spill them up, and kind of see what we can do, how the resources kind of play versus using your traditional VM there. But if that's something you'd like to see, let me know in the comments down below. Let me know, are you going to be running this already? Are you going to wait a few releases? Now, if you want to see everything that we do have on offer, like the HL15 Beast here, head on over to store.45homelab.com. All of our socials will be in the description down below. And with that said, I'm Zach Perry, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Have a good one. Now I'm losing my steam. Oh yeah, we're at the last part. Yes. All right, let's take her there. Preview, tech preview, like, say that a million times fast, but